Feudal Japan gets romanticized hard. Cherry blossoms, honor-bound swordsmen, tea ceremonies, the whole aesthetic package. But peel back the woodblock prints, and you find a society run on rigid control, casual violence, and rules that treated human lives as expendable line items. Here's what counted as an ordinary day under the shoguns. A samurai could legally kill you for a bad attitude. There was a legal principle in Edo period Japan called kirisute gomen, authorization to cut and leave. It gave samurai the right to kill a commoner on the spot if that person was judged to have insulted their honor. No trial, no appeal, no real oversight. A merchant who didn't bow low enough, a peasant who talked back, a stranger who bumped into the wrong person on a crowded street. Any of it could, in theory, end with a sword. In practice, the samurai was still expected to report the killing and could face consequences if the justification looked flimsy. But the burden of proof sat overwhelmingly with the corpse, not the swordsman. It's hard to overstate how differently people moved through daily life when literally anyone wearing two swords had a standing legal excuse to end you. Swords were tested on human bodies. New swords, especially those forged for high-ranking samurai, needed to be proven before they were trusted in battle. The method was called tameshigiri, literally test cutting, and while bundled straw mats or bamboo were common targets, the historical record is blunt about the fact that executed criminals' corpses, and in earlier periods even living prisoners, were used to test blade quality. Specialists existed whose entire profession was performing these cuts and certifying a sword's effectiveness, sometimes stacking multiple bodies to test how many a single stroke could pass through. A sword's resume, quite literally, could include a body count before it ever saw a battlefield. Your family could be held hostage, permanently. The shogunate ran a system called Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance, which forced every daimyo, or regional lord, to spend alternating years living in the capital under the shogun's watch and the rest of the time governing their home domain. That part is well known. What's less discussed is the second half of the arrangement. A daimyo's wife and heir were required to live permanently in Edo, essentially as polite, well-dressed hostages, for the daimyo's entire career. If a lord out in his home province got any ideas about rebellion, the shogun already had his family in hand. It was an extraordinarily effective control mechanism dressed up as court etiquette, and it also quietly bankrupted many domains, since maintaining two households and constant costly travel processions drained treasuries that could have gone toward anything else. Buildings were sometimes built on top of people. Older Japanese folklore and some historical accounts describe a practice called hitobashira, human pillar. The belief that burying a living person at the base of a bridge, castle wall, or dam would appease the spirits and prevent the structure from collapsing. While scholars debate how widespread the literal practice actually was, versus how much survives only as legend, castle construction records and regional folk traditions across the feudal period consistently reference the custom, and several existing sites in Japan carry local legends naming the specific person supposedly interred beneath them. Whether every story is literal history or not, the fact that it was a culturally coherent idea, that a building stability might require a human sacrifice, tells you something about how disposable individual lives could be treated in service of a lord's monument. Loyalty unto death wasn't just a saying. When a samurai's lord died, a disturbing number of his retainers were expected to follow him into death through a practice called junshi, or following in death, essentially ritual suicide performed purely out of loyalty, with no crime or dishonor involved at all. It became so common after the death of certain prominent lords that the shogunate eventually had to step in and ban it outright in 1663, worried that domains were bleeding out their most capable men every time a leader died of old age. The ban itself is telling. Authorities weren't objecting on moral grounds so much as practical ones. Losing a generation of experienced retainers to a wave of copycat suicides every time a lord passed away was, from the state's perspective, an inefficient use of manpower. Animals were protected by law before people were. Under the fifth shogun, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, A series of edicts collectively known as Shorui Awaremi no Rei, the laws of compassion for living things, made it a serious crime to harm animals, particularly dogs, which the shogun personally adored. Killing a dog, even accidentally, could result in exile or execution. Elderly and sick dogs were to be cared for at public expense, and enormous kennels were built in Edo to house thousands of strays at taxpayer cost. Meanwhile, ordinary peasants during the same decades were dying in famines with far less institutional urgency directed toward their survival. The nickname history gave the shogun, the dog shogun, undersells just how surreal it was to live in a period where harming an animal could get you killed, while starving farmers received comparatively little relief. Famine turned children into currency. Edo Japan suffered several catastrophic famines, and during the worst of them, particularly the Tenmei famine of the 1780s, desperate rural families sold their own children outright, not just into brothel contracts, but into indentured farm labor, domestic servitude, or simple resale to families who needed extra hands. Some records from famine-stricken domains describe parents killing infants they could not feed, a grim practice with its own euphemistic vocabulary, distinct from the infanticide driven by poverty in ordinary years. Local governments occasionally issued famine relief, but response times and effectiveness varied wildly by domain, and the overall burden of survival fell almost entirely on the families themselves. Even death had a class system. Feudal Japan's rigid four-tier class structure didn't stop at the grave. Burial practices, funeral rites, and even the size and style of a permitted gravestone were dictated by social rank. Certain outcast communities were barred from being buried in the same grounds as other townspeople at all, regardless of how long their families had lived in a town or how faithfully they'd served it. The hierarchy that dictated where you could stand, what you could wear, and who you could marry followed people past their last breath, reinforcing a rigid order that gave almost no one, outside the samurai class, any real say over their own life, and often not much say over their own death either. Your crimes were tattooed onto your body. Long before tattoos became a form of self-expression in Japan, they were a punishment. Convicted criminals in many domains were marked with irizumi, punitive tattoos applied to the arms or forehead, often in patterns specific to the crime or the region, sometimes accumulating additional lines with each repeat offense. Unlike a prison sentence, this punishment never ended. A tattooed arm followed a person for the rest of their life, marking them publicly as a criminal in every town they ever visited and cutting off most paths back into normal work or family life. It's a major reason tattoos carried such heavy stigma in Japan for centuries afterward. The association wasn't rebellion or art, it was branding in the most literal sense. And it's a stigma that in some circles persists even today. A society built to watch itself. Feudal Japan didn't rely only on samurai and shogunate officials to keep people in line. It built surveillance into the neighborhood structure itself. Under a system called Goningumi, or five-person groups, households were organized into small mutual responsibility units where neighbors were legally accountable for each other's behavior. If one household in the group broke the law, hid a criminal, failed to pay taxes, or sheltered an unregistered Christian, the entire group could be punished alongside them. This turned ordinary villagers into unpaid, involuntary informants on their own neighbors, since staying silent about someone else's wrongdoing could get your own family fined, flogged, or worse. It was social control achieved not through constant policing, but by making every household a potential enforcer against everyone next door. So, was feudal Japan the disciplined, honor-bound society its popular image suggests, or a tightly controlled system that kept order through fear, hostages, and casual brutality? Let us know what you think, and tell us which era or region you'd like covered next.